good evening. Tonight, let's go back to Victorian England, not to talk about queens, wars, or grand history, but to see something closer to real life, what ordinary people actually ate. Imagine you're floating above London in the mid-1800s. Night falls. Gas lamps glow through the damp fog. Your gaze slips through a roof and into a cramped, dim room. There's a bedroom, living room, and kitchen all in one. A weak fire flickers in the hearth. A family sits around a rough wooden table. There are no plates. Everyone holds a thick, dark, coarse loaf, household bread baked with cheap flour. Hunger comes first. Calories are what matter. The children dip bread into a small bowl. It isn't butter. It's dripping, the fat that falls from roasting meat. An affordable substitute for poor families and a rare treat of energy. At the centre sits a pot of the main course, vegetable soup, or more honestly, boiled vegetable mash. The cheapest greens you can find, carrots, and above all, onions. In Victorian London, onions were the poor man's friend. Cheap, everywhere, in nearly every dish. Roasted, fried, stewed. Meat was a luxury. Maybe on Sundays you'd get a tiny bit, stewed pig's cheek or a lump of shin beef. That counted as a feast. For families with even less, dinner might be nothing more than a slice of bread with a few raw beetroot pieces, bulky to the stomach, light on nutrition. This is the working class table, simple, repetitive, built around one goal: get through today. Now pull away from the dark lane and drift west to London's West End. Streets are wider. The gaslight shines brighter. Through heavy curtains you enter a bright dining room. A long table gleams under snow-white linen. Silverware and crystal sparkle. It's a family dinner too, but it looks like another planet. Here dinner isn't a single pot. It is a ceremony, course after course. First, soup. Not ordinary vegetable broth, but the most fashionable luxury of the age. Turtle soup, a status symbol for the very rich. The rising middle class, unable to afford real turtle, invented mock turtle made from a calf's head and feet to mimic the taste and texture. It became so popular it even shows up in Alice in Wonderland. After soup comes fish, and then the main roast, a whole haunch of venison, or a colossal roast of beef, grandly called the Baron of Beef. The size is the message. Abundance equals prestige. In truth, these dinners produced astonishing amounts of food, often far more than guests could eat, because leftovers fed the servants and kept the whole household machine running. The style was French influenced. Wealthy families hired French chefs and cared as much about presentation as flavour. Two tables, two worlds. In Victorian Britain, the class gap was written clearly in what people ate. For the poor, food was fuel, cheap onions, warm dripping, heavy bread. For the rich, food was theatre, a carefully staged show of rare ingredients, French names, and exaggerated portions designed to signal status. Step back into the streets. It's late. Factory shifts end. Workers pour out, tired and hungry. Most live in tiny rooms without proper kitchens, so dinner often comes from the street. This moving feast is the distinctive wage earner way of eating. Quick, hot, and pay as you go. First, the smell of baked potatoes. A painted metal can sits on a brazier to keep them steaming hot. For a penny, the seller splits one open, adds a pat of butter, a pinch of salt and pepper. On a cold London night, a hot potato fills the stomach and warms the hands. Walk on, a salty tide of sea smells, street seafood. Stalls pile up little treasures, cooked cockles and whelks, pickled periwinkles. You eat with a pin, the perfect on-the-go snack. Stalls cluster near gin shops, so customers can step in for a warming drink, ginger beer or something stronger. Farther along, steak and kidney pies and hot eels, jellied eels, eel soup, grilled eel, shouted in a sing-song by eel sellers. If that's too heavy, there are lighter bites, peppery watercress, an early salad, or baked apples for dessert. At the very bottom sits the humblest of foods, sheep's trotters, once used to make glue. As industry found cheaper substitutes, trotters became poor people's protein. For a low-paid worker, a baked potato and a trotter could be a whole dinner. Just when you think the feast is over, you hear a bell. The muffin man arrives, carrying a basket under a thick cloth, with warm muffins and crumpets still steaming. Technically, bell-ringing vendors were banned in 1839 for disturbing the peace, but Londoners ignored the rule. In crowded cities with few home kitchens, street food wasn't just convenient, it felt like freedom. No etiquette, no tips, no master watching. With a few coins, a worker could choose tonight's menu in the order he liked. That small act of choice mattered in a life ruled by factory clocks and strict social rules. Now zoom in on one food that seems surprising today: oysters. In the 1860s, oysters were everywhere and cheaper than potatoes. Hawkers pried them open on street corners and you slurped them down with briny liquor, tossing shells onto pavements already carpeted with crushed shells. Records say Londoners ate around 700 million oysters in 1864 alone. They fed rich and poor alike. Gentlemen took a few oysters as a starter at a stall. Middle-class cooks stuffed cheap oysters into steak pies to bulk them out. Railways brought fresh oysters inland, and canning extended their shelf life. But behind the abundance lay danger. The River Thames had become a vast open sewer. Oysters, being filter feeders, concentrated whatever was in the water, including deadly germs. Eating oysters could be a culinary delight, or a one-way ticket to cholera or typhoid. Overfishing, industrial pollution, and later the arrival of cheap refrigerated meat from abroad all helped push oysters off the poor man's plate and into luxury menus. Back in the slums, the kitchen was often just a fireplace in the corner. A single iron pot did everything: boiling, stewing, heating water, even drying clothes. Most poor homes had no oven. Breads and pies were mixed at home, but taken to communal bakehouses for a small fee, turning baking into a social moment while neighbours waited and chatted. Storage was a shelf with a brown sack of flour, some potatoes and onions, and a hard cheese wrapped in cloth. Without refrigeration, hard cheese was prized because it kept. When it hardened like a rock, mothers softened it over the fire and shared it with the children. Butter was expensive, so dripping stood in. Milk was often watered down by dishonest dealers. Some families kept a hen or two in a tiny yard, precious assets that supplied eggs when meat wasn't on the table. Safe water was a constant problem. Pumps drew from sources easily contaminated by cesspits. Boiling was costly, so low alcohol small beer was often safer than water, even for children, because brewing heat killed many germs. Now pass through a metaphorical door into the basement of a grand townhouse. This is the engine room, the kitchen. At its heart stands a huge cast iron range, hot, hungry for coal, tended from dawn to dusk by servants who fed the fire and shoveled ash to keep temperatures steady. This kitchen was a disciplined factory. A head cook, often French, if the family was very fashionable, ruled the brigade. Beneath were kitchen maids who chopped, stirred, and prepped. At the bottom, scullery maids scrubbed mountains of pans and floors. The kitchen was physically isolated from the family's rooms, downstairs or at the back, separated by thick green baize doors and a dumbwaiter that lifted dishes silently upstairs. The message was simple: labour stays out of sight, elegance stays untouched. Equipment here was a world apart from the slums. Rows of shining copper pans tinned inside, specialised tools, cherry stoners, cheese graters, potato peelers, odd jelly moulds and pastry cutters. Canned foods existed, but for years there was no can opener. People literally used a hammer and chisel until proper openers spread in the 1870s. In many ways, this kitchen mirrored the Industrial Revolution itself. A central engine, division of labour, a production line aimed at turning out perfect meals while hiding the sweat and smoke that made upstairs luxury possible. Not all Victorian food stories are delicious. Adulteration, faking or bulking out food was rampant. Bread might be whitened and weighted with rice flour or even gypsum. Bright candies coloured with poisonous dyes, mercuric sulfide for red, lead chromate for yellow, copper compounds for green. Mustard bulked with turmeric dyed flour, and worse. Pickles kept green with copper sulfate. Watered milk thickened with starches. Beer bittered with toxic extracts. Used tea leaves dried, re-dyed, and resold. The hero who blew the whistle was Dr. Arthur Hill Hassel. In the early 1850s, the Lancet funded his investigation. Using the era's high-tech tool, a microscope, he bought thousands of random food samples and examined them, then backed findings with chemical tests. From 1851 to 1854, the Lancet published his reports and even named the offending sellers. Public outrage pushed Parliament to pass the first Food Adulteration Act in 1860. Weak at first, it still began modern food safety law. The deeper lesson? In a giant, anonymous city, buyers and makers were strangers. The old village trust, knowing your baker and your dairyman, was gone. Science, a microscope, and law had to rebuild trust through transparency and rules. Next, the markets, the beating stomach of London. Smithfield, transformed in the Victorian era from a chaotic live animal market into a modern wholesale meat market. Dazzled and shocked, endless carcasses under a vast glass roof, floors slick with wash water and blood, cleavers thudding, traders shouting. Down river, Billingsgate Fish Market hit you with briny air, river silt, and piles of gleaming fish and shellfish. Auctions ran fast, a Dutch-style descending price, and the famously loud Sharp-tongued fishwives gave the places its unforgettable voice. These markets were more than places to buy food. They were city theatres where classes crossed paths in a 24-hour rhythm. For quiet refinement, step into the birth of afternoon tea. Around 1840, Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, found the long gap between noon dinner and ever later evening meals unbearable. She asked for a tray at 4 or 5, hot black tea, buttered bread, small cakes. It worked so well she invited friends. The fashion spread among society women. Soon afternoon tea developed its classic 3-tier stand. Finger sandwiches below, cucumber, smoked salmon, egg, scones with clotted cream and strawberry jam in the middle, dainty pastries on top. Tea also sat at the heart of a moral battle. The gin palaces, bright, mirrored halls selling cheap gin, had ravaged the poor in earlier decades. Temperance activists learned that preaching wasn't enough. They offered an attractive alternative. Tea meetings with free bread, cakes, fruit, endless hot tea, even alcohol-free music rooms and billiards. In a consumer society, the fight for souls happens through better choices on the table. Victorians also loved showy sweets, especially jellies and puddings. Industrial gelatin and intricate metal moulds let cooks build wobbling, stained glass towers, clear jellies with fruit mosaics suspended inside. Even patterns that stayed perfect in every slice. Pudding in Britain could mean desserts in general, but also specific steamed or boiled dishes, sweet like spotted dick, sweat, flour, dried fruit, custard on top, or savoury like steak and kidney pudding, a sweat crust slowly infused with rich gravy. Empire reshaped tastes, too. Curry travelled from India to British tables, but it changed on the way. Milder heat, additions like chicken stock, cream, even apple. Mulligatawny, from Tamil Milaguthani, pepper water, became a classic Anglo-Indian soup course. Kedgeree turned a South Asian rice dish into a smoky British breakfast with flaked fish, eggs, and curry powder. Monday, curry-fied leftovers were a thrifty housewife's trick before fridges. Other colonial-era icons appeared. Worcestershire sauce, Lear and Perrin's happy accident trying to copy a remembered Indian relish. And the gin and tonic, quinine-laced tonic water for malaria, made palatable with gin, soda, and lime. Many modern British food traditions were shaped in the Victorian age. The family Christmas dinner, popularised by Queen Victoria, Prince Albert's German tree, and Dickens's stories. The Sunday roast, boosted by cheaper meat and a rising middle class. And fish and chips, two separate streety foods first paired late in the 19th century, soon a national staple. So, was Victorian food a disaster or a foundation? One view says industrial urban life pushed Britain toward bland, standardised, even adulterated food, weakening cooking traditions. Another says it was the crucial groundwork of modern cuisine, new tech, rail, canning, global flavours through empire, and standardised recipes, think Mrs. Beaton, that shared kitchen knowledge widely. Either way, Victorians were the first truly modern eaters, mass market consumers, global samplers, safety warriors, and social meaning makers at the table. Many of our debates today, organic versus processed, local versus global, health versus convenience, grew from seeds planted then. Their stories on the plate are still echoing on ours,